What happens when a star makes a blockbuster, but the studio swears it lost money? Welcome to the twisted world of Hollywood accounting, where profits vanish, legends go unpaid, and fortunes are quietly buried in spreadsheets. In this video, we reveal 25 stars who were robbed by the very system that made them famous. Stick around. Some of these stories will leave your jaw on the floor. Art Buckwald. Art Buckwald never expected to become a Hollywood whistleblower. A Pulitzer Prize-winning humorist, he pitched a story idea to Paramount Pictures, an African prince in search of love in America. Years later, the studio released Coming to America, starring Eddie Murphy, and Buckwald instantly recognized the storyline. He sued and won. But what the court revealed shocked the industry. Despite earning over $288 million, Paramount claimed the movie made no profit. Why? Because of creative accounting, hidden fees, bloated distribution costs, and studio overhead buried the actual earnings. Buchwald's case became the ultimate proof that even massive hits could be declared losses on paper. His victory exposed a sinister blueprint: deny creators their rightful cut, and hide millions behind contracts nobody but lawyers understand. Though he eventually settled for a fraction of what he was owed, Buchwald's legacy lives on. His case is now taught in law schools as a turning point in fighting back against studio deception. He didn't just want his check. He wanted justice. And for once, Hollywood's math got caught in the spotlight. David Prowse. He was the body of Darth Vader, the towering figure who terrified audiences and became an icon. But David Prowse, the man inside the suit, ended up betrayed by the force he helped create. When Return of the Jedi wrapped, Prowse was promised a share of the profits. The film grossed over $475 million globally. But somehow, Lucasfilm insisted it never turned a profit. Prowse received nothing. The British actor was locked into a deal that relied on net profits, a trap in Hollywood where studios can make a hit appear like a flop through accounting tricks. Prowse, who wasn't even told his voice would be dubbed by James Earl Jones, felt increasingly sidelined. He spoke out, and in return, was banned from Star Wars events. Fans were furious. How could the man behind one of cinema's greatest villains be cast aside like this? Prowse died in 2020, still never seeing a dime from Jedi. His story remains a painful lesson. Even when you wear the armor of a legend, studios can still make you invisible. And in Prowse's case, they made sure his legacy stayed in the shadows. Winston Groom. Winston Groom wrote the novel Forrest Gump, a quirky, heartfelt story that turned into one of the most beloved films in cinema history. When Paramount adapted it in 1994, Groom should have struck gold. The film grossed over $680 million worldwide. But when he asked for his contracted share of the profits, the studio claimed the film hadn't made money. How is that possible? Through the dark magic of Hollywood accounting. Paramount used internal charges, inflated overhead, and mysterious fees to make Forrest Gump look like a financial failure. Groom had sold the rights cheaply, just $350,000 and a modest back-end percentage, which vanished into thin air. In protest, he refused to let the studio adapt the sequel, Gump and Company. Even Tom Hanks and director Robert Zemeckis were reportedly denied fair shares, later negotiating lump sum payments to avoid more accounting nightmares. Groom's experience became one of the clearest examples of how studios exploit even their biggest successes. He gave the world an unforgettable character, but Hollywood gave him a cold shoulder. It wasn't just the check, it was the betrayal. Groom passed away in 2020, but his loss remains a permanent footnote in Gump's legacy. Sylvester Stallone. He was Rocky. He was Rambo. But even Sylvester Stallone, a box office titan, had to fight dirty when it came to studio profits. In the early days, Stallone agreed to back-end points on the Rocky sequels. But as the years passed, he noticed something strange. Millions in global earnings were reported, Yet his royalty statements barely budged. United Artists, and later MGM, used questionable accounting to reduce his profit share. When Stallone finally confronted the studios, he discovered the royalty calculations were riddled with absurd expenses. Marketing fees charged after theatrical runs ended. Executive bonuses deducted from his own cut. Stallone later revealed that he had to threaten lawsuits just to get what he was owed. He called out the entire system as corrupt, warning younger actors not to fall for back-end traps unless they had ironclad contracts and ruthless legal teams. Despite being a megastar, Stallone's biggest fight wasn't on screen. It was behind closed doors, in boardrooms lined with lawyers. It showed that no matter how big your name is, if you're not watching the books, someone else is cooking them. Peter Jackson. Peter Jackson turned The Lord of the Rings into a cinematic triumph, grossing nearly $3 billion. But when he asked New Line Cinema for an audit to verify his earnings, they told him to forget it. Jackson was stunned. His contract entitled him to a cut of merchandise and profits from the first film. But somehow, despite its massive success, the Fellowship of the Ring was declared not profitable. Sound familiar? Jackson sued in 2005, alleging New Line padded its books with phantom expenses, internal distribution fees, mysterious interest charges, and licensing kickbacks. The lawsuit revealed how studios exploit contract language to bleed money away from creators. The fallout was huge. New Line, once a Hollywood powerhouse, lost Jackson's trust and its reputation. Though the case was settled quietly, it forever changed how directors approached back-end deals. Jackson won't talk about the final settlement, but his stance remains clear. Creativity doesn't end when the cameras stop rolling. It extends to the ledgers. And if the studio hides the gold, sometimes you have to go on a real-life quest to reclaim it. Stan Lee. Stan Lee wasn't just the face of Marvel. He was its architect. From Spider-Man to the X-Men, his imagination powered billion-dollar franchises. But when those heroes took over the box office, Lee discovered something shocking. He was cut out of the profits. His 1998 contract guaranteed him 10% of profits from any film or show using his characters. But when Spider-Man and X-Men exploded into global hits, Lee's mailbox stayed empty. He sued Marvel in 2002, demanding transparency. Their response? They claimed the movies hadn't technically made profits. Instead, they'd been swallowed by distribution fees, marketing deductions, and studio overhead. Sound familiar? After a bitter legal battle, Lee finally settled for a reported $10 million, a mere drop compared to what he was owed. Though he remained the smiling cameo in Marvel films, the betrayal ran deep. He once said, "I created them, and now they belong to the world." But in reality, they belong to the studio. Lee gave the world superheroes. In return, the system treated him like a footnote. That irony stings more than any villain's punch. Edward Norton. Edward Norton poured his soul into 2008's The Incredible Hulk, rewriting the script, deeply researching the character, and even joining in the editing process. He didn't just want to be Bruce Banner. He wanted to redefine him. The film earned over $260 million and was considered a soft reboot for Marvel. But behind the scenes, trouble brewed. Norton expected creative control and a meaningful cut of the back end. Marvel Studios, however, had other plans. When Norton began pressing for transparency on box office profits and merchandise revenues, the studio distanced itself. They claimed he was difficult to work with and cut him from future appearances, including The Avengers. Fans were stunned. Norton had given the role gravitas, yet was replaced without warning. Some insiders whispered it had more to do with money and control than attitude. Norton never sued, but the split left a bitter taste. Here was a serious actor invested in building a franchise, only to be ghosted by the system he helped jumpstart. It wasn't just about losing the role. It was about losing trust in an industry that promised partnership, then delivered profit-first politics. James Garner. James Garner wasn't just a television icon. He was one of the few stars who took on Hollywood accounting and won. In the 70s, The Rockford Files was a massive TV hit, and Garner was promised a cut of the show's ongoing profits through syndication. But as reruns aired and VHS sales rolled in, his checks didn't reflect the success. Garner smelled a rat. He sued Universal in 1980, demanding a full audit. What he uncovered was staggering. The studio had allegedly hidden millions in profits through deceptive accounting. Garner had been systematically underpaid for years. In a rare Hollywood twist, he won the case, receiving millions in back payments. The lawsuit didn't just vindicate him. It inspired others to start questioning their own royalty statements. Garner proved you didn't have to be a studio exec to understand contracts. You just had to be bold enough to read the fine print. He once said, "If you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will." In the end, Garner wasn't just a private eye on screen. He became one in real life, solving a mystery even Hollywood tried to bury. Kim Basinger. Kim Basinger was on top of the world in the early 90s, an Oscar nominee, a bankable star, and Hollywood royalty. But one decision almost destroyed her. After agreeing to star in the controversial indie film Boxing Helena, Basinger changed her mind. The script was bizarre. A surgeon who amputates a woman's limbs to keep her forever. Basinger backed out, citing creative concerns. But the producers sued for breach of contract, and when the court sided with them, she was ordered to pay over $8 million. Basinger filed for bankruptcy. But what few knew was this. Her original contract had loopholes, and her own studio reps may have misled her about the exit terms. It wasn't just a creative dispute. It was a trap, financially and legally. The fallout was brutal. She lost roles, respect, and nearly her career. Though she later bounced back with LA Confidential, the scars remained. Basinger became a cautionary tale, not about diva behavior, but about how actors can be devoured by legal fine print and profit politics they don't even control. In a town where glamour hides the gears, Basinger learned the hard way. One misstep can mean financial annihilation. Bert Reynolds. Bert Reynolds was once the highest-paid actor in the world, smiling from red carpets, dominating the box office with hits like Smokey, and The Bandit, Deliverance, and later Boogie Nights. But behind that signature grin was a financial story soaked in studio betrayal. Reynolds often agreed to back-end deals, points on profits, rather than upfront salaries. But time and again, the profits never materialized. Studios claimed losses, despite films earning tens of millions. One of the most glaring examples was Boogie Nights, where Reynolds' performance was universally praised. Yet, he saw barely a fraction of the profits due to vague contractual terms and Hollywood's ever-slippery accounting. To make matters worse, his business managers also failed him, missing clauses and payments. By the 1990s, Reynolds had declared bankruptcy, selling personal belongings to cover mounting debts. The man who once ruled Hollywood was now fighting to keep his house. In interviews, he never blamed one person, but he always pointed to the system. A star who gave his life to the screen, only to be bled by the very deals meant to secure his future. Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds was more than a movie star. She was America's sweetheart, the radiant lead in Singin' in the Rain, and a tireless entertainer for decades. But beneath the sparkle, Reynolds endured brutal financial exploitation. After a string of successful films, Reynolds assumed her MGM years would provide residual security. They didn't. Studios in the 1950s offered no profit sharing, and when new licensing avenues like VHS and television syndication emerged, Reynolds was cut out. She later tried to secure royalties for her work, but was told her old contracts didn't apply. She opened a Las Vegas hotel and museum to preserve classic Hollywood history, using her own funds and memorabilia. But even that crumbled due to unpaid debts and lack of support. By the 1990s, Reynolds was forced to auction her treasured costume collection, including Marilyn Monroe's iconic white dress, just to stay afloat. It was a devastating loss. A woman who embodied the golden age of Hollywood had to sell its very history to survive. Reynolds never stopped performing, but she never forgot how the system discarded its stars. Her life became a painful reminder. The industry that makes legends is often the first to forget them. Carrie Fisher. Carrie Fisher was royalty, not just galactic, but cinematic. As Princess Leia in Star Wars, she became one of the most recognizable figures in pop culture history. But behind the fame was a stunning financial reality. Fisher barely made money from Leia. Her original contract from 1977 didn't include merchandising rights, and she didn't think to ask for them. Why would she? No one expected action figures, lunchboxes, and Halloween costumes to rake in billions. But they did. And while George Lucas and the studios made fortunes, Fisher saw almost nothing. She publicly joked that every time she saw her face on a shampoo bottle, she died a little inside. Even her image in The Force Awakens brought only modest compensation, because she had no control over her likeness. Fisher was candid about her mental health, her struggles with addiction, and her complex relationship with fame. But the harshest pill was knowing that the role that defined her also exploited her. She once said, "I was a joke, but I made people laugh." What she didn't say, but many fans believe, is that she deserved more than just laughter. She deserved justice. Jackie Kugan. Before Shirley Temple, there was Jackie Kugan, the first true child star. At just 7 years old, he dazzled audiences in Charlie Chaplin's The Kid, charming the world and raking in millions for his films. But when Kugan came of age, he discovered a horror. His mother and stepfather had spent nearly all of his earnings. They claimed it was theirs to spend. Kugan sued, and though he won, he recovered only a fraction of what he'd earned. The scandal shocked the nation and led to the creation of the Kugan Law, which required a portion of child actors' earnings to be preserved in a trust. But it came too late for Jackie. His later years were filled with odd TV roles, most notably Uncle Fester in The Addams Family. But the shine of his early fame was forever dulled by betrayal. Kugan's story remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of Hollywood's darkest failure, profiting off a child, then discarding him. He was a trailblazer, but also a victim. The law bears his name, but the scars were his to carry. Elvis Presley. He was the king of rock and roll, a global icon. But in Hollywood, Elvis Presley was anything but royalty. Throughout the 1960s, Elvis starred in a string of formulaic musicals, many of them box office hits. Yet he saw only a small portion of the profits. Why? Because of Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis's infamous manager struck ruthless deals with studios that prioritized quick cash over career legacy. The studios made millions. Elvis got fixed fees with no back end and no control. Worse, Parker took a staggering 50% commission, double the industry norm. Elvis was trapped in exploitative contracts and spent his prime years cranking out films he loathed just to keep the machine fed. By the time he broke free, the damage was done. He died at 42, exhausted, disillusioned, and financially drained compared to what he should have had. The king built empires with his name and face, but the kingdom belonged to others. In the end, Elvis became a product, sold, boxed, and emptied. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando was already a legend when he signed on to play Jor-El in Superman. For just a few minutes of screen time, he secured a then-record $3.7 million and a promised 11.75% of back-end profits. The film soared, making over $300 million. But when Brando checked his royalty statements, he found something strange. There were no profits. Warner Brothers claimed expenses wiped out earnings. Brando sued, alleging the studio had buried profits through shady bookkeeping. In retaliation, Warner Brothers cut his scenes from Superman 2. The lawsuit dragged on, eventually settling out of court. But it exposed a painful truth. Not even Brando, one of the most powerful names in Hollywood, was immune to creative accounting. The incident embittered him toward the industry. He called studio executives liars and refused to promote their films. Brando may have had a volcanic temper and erratic work habits, but he wasn't wrong. The studios were manipulating numbers to erase obligations. And Brando, with all his clout, still had to fight for every dime. When Jor-El warned his son about the dangers of Earth, perhaps he should have added, especially the contracts. Bob Hoskins. Bob Hoskins gave one of the most physically demanding and emotionally layered performances of his career in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Acting opposite invisible cartoon characters for months nearly broke him, yet the result was a groundbreaking hybrid that made over $330 million worldwide. Hoskins, under contract, was supposed to receive a healthy share of the profits. But years passed, and the checks didn't come. When he inquired, Disney claimed the film hadn't made any real money. The explanation? Standard studio accounting tricks, inflated advertising costs, mysterious consulting fees, and internal charges that reduced paper profits to zero. Hoskins was stunned. He had risked his health for the role, suffering hallucinations and burnout from the intense green screen work, only to be robbed of the reward. Though he never sued, those close to him said it left a bitter mark. Hoskins went on to star in more hits, but he rarely spoke about Roger Rabbit again. The man who carried one of cinema's boldest experiments was left carrying the burden of invisible profit, just like the invisible co-stars he once acted with. Michael Moore. Michael Moore's Fahrenheit. 9/11 was the highest-grossing documentary of all time, earning over $220 million worldwide. But when Moore tallied what he received in return, something didn't add up. The Weinstein brothers, who had distributed the film, allegedly shorted him on tens of millions of dollars in profits. Moore sued in 2011, claiming Hollywood accounting had once again turned a record-breaking success into a supposed financial dud. The Weinsteins responded with counter-lawsuits and a PR campaign that painted Moore as greedy. But court documents revealed the usual tactics: money funneled through sister companies, marketing costs far exceeding reason, and other expenses that conveniently ate away profits. The case eventually settled quietly, but the damage lingered. Moore had hoped his film would expose political lies. Ironically, he had to spend years exposing lies about the very film itself. In interviews, Moore later warned independent filmmakers, "The biggest con isn't in Washington, it's in Hollywood royalty checks." For someone who built a career calling out injustice, Moore had become a victim of the very greed he spent his life confronting. John Cusack. John Cusack has long been a thinking actor, one who carefully chooses roles and avoids the typical Hollywood machine. But even he wasn't immune to its traps. In interviews, Cusack has openly criticized studios for systematically manipulating accounting to deny artists their fair share. He spoke about films like Grosse Pointe Blank and High Fidelity, which performed well and built cult followings, yet allegedly never turned real profits on paper. Cusack claimed he often received back-end deals that mysteriously disappeared once studios filed their final financials. While he didn't take legal action, his outspokenness shed light on how even mid-budget films, those without blockbuster-level scrutiny, get cooked in the books. Studios charge themselves distribution fees, hide expenses in shell companies, and reroute revenue to obscure entities. Cusack called it a game of creative theft. He may not have lost mansions or declared bankruptcy, but what he lost was trust. Trust in a system that promised partnership, then played hide-and-seek with the truth. For fans who admire his integrity, Cusack's quiet revelations speak volumes about an industry built on illusion, even in its accounting. Robin Williams. When Robin Williams lent his voice to the genie in Aladdin, he didn't do it for the paycheck. In fact, he agreed to a heavily discounted rate, just $75,000, on the condition that Disney would not use his voice or image to sell merchandise. Williams, ever the principled artist, wanted to maintain the integrity of the character. But after the film became a runaway hit, Disney broke that promise. The genie's voice was everywhere, on toys, commercials, fast food ads, making millions. Furious, Williams publicly denounced the studio, saying they lied to him in the most offensive way possible. He refused to work with Disney again. The studio later sent him a Picasso painting as an apology, but the damage was done. Williams had been exploited not just financially, but artistically. For a man who gave his heart to every role, the betrayal cut deep. He eventually returned for Aladdin and The King of Thieves, but not before exposing how studios will even monetize goodwill. His story isn't just about money. It's about how even magic can be twisted by greed. David Duchovny. David Duchovny was the face of The X-Files, a cultural juggernaut that ran for 9 seasons and spawned 2 feature films. At the height of the show's success, Duchovny sued 20th Century Fox, accusing them of self-dealing. The studio had allegedly sold the rights to reruns and syndication to its own affiliated networks at artificially low prices, thus reducing the profit pool Duchovny was supposed to share. The actor's lawsuit unveiled a deep-rooted issue: studios licensing shows to themselves to cook the books and keep profits in-house. Duchovny won a substantial settlement, reportedly in the tens of millions, but it cost him trust in the system. He continued to work with the franchise, but the experience left a sour note. For a show centered on revealing hidden truths, Duchovny lived through a real-world conspiracy where the numbers were as mysterious as any alien life form. The truth was out there, and it showed just how far studios would go to keep profits hidden. Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin was known for his gravelly voice, rugged presence, and commanding screen performances. By the late 60s, he had become one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, especially after The Dirty Dozen, a war film that was both a critical and commercial smash. But when Marvin later checked on his earnings, something didn't feel right. Though the film grossed over $45 million, Marvin saw only a fraction of what he expected. Suspecting deception, he began investigating the studio's accounting. What he discovered echoed what many others would later find: phony deductions, bloated distribution costs, and so-called studio fees that wiped out profits on paper. Marvin, never one to back down from a fight, publicly questioned how studios were allowed to get away with such blatant misrepresentation. Though he never pursued a full-blown lawsuit, his voice added to the chorus of artists warning about Hollywood's rigged system. For a man who fought battles on screen, it was the behind-the-scenes war with profit statements that proved to be the most infuriating and unsolvable. Mike Meyers. Austin Powers wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. With catchphrases, merchandise, and a loyal fan base, it became one of the most profitable comedy franchises of the late 1990s. Mike Meyers wrote it, starred in it, and helped shape its success from the ground up. But when it came time to collect on the back end, Meyers found the mojo had mysteriously disappeared. Despite hundreds of millions in revenue, back-end payouts were strangely low. Meyers didn't launch a lawsuit, but insiders say he was furious over how the profits were accounted for. Toys, DVDs, fast food deals, all of it generated major money. Yet the studio's books suggested razor-thin margins. The suspected reason: internal licensing, overhead inflation, and promotional costs that conveniently swallowed up the profits. For a character who outwitted supervillains with flair, it turned out the true villain was buried in legalese. And while Austin Powers made the world laugh, Meyers quietly learned that even creating an empire doesn't mean you get to rule it. Angela Bassett. Angela Bassett is one of Hollywood's most respected actresses, known for commanding performances in films like What's Love Got to Do with It and Malcolm X. But behind the scenes, Bassett has spoken out about how black actors, especially women, are often systematically underpaid and excluded from profit-sharing deals. Despite being the lead or critical support in films that found massive success, she was often offered contracts with no meaningful back-end participation. Industry insiders have noted that several of her films, especially in the 1990s and early 2000s, became cult or financial successes after release, yet yielded little compensation for her. She has repeatedly highlighted how studios rarely renegotiate deals or offer retroactive bonuses, even when profits exceed expectations. Bassett's experience underscores the double bind of race and gender in Hollywood accounting, where underpayment isn't just a glitch, but a pattern. A queen on screen, she has had to fight tooth and nail off screen just to receive what should have been hers by right. Her story isn't just about loss. It's about resilience in an industry that still resists fairness. Samuel L. Jackson. Samuel L. Jackson is one of the highest-grossing actors of all time, thanks largely to his long-standing role as Nick Fury in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But even Jackson wasn't spared from Hollywood's accounting maze. After appearing in multiple Marvel films, Jackson reportedly learned that early back-end deals were offering minimal returns, even when the movies broke box office records. Disney and Marvel's accounting showed small profit margins after massive expenses were deducted, many of which were internal. Jackson, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, renegotiated hard in later years, reportedly demanding stronger back-end participation and guarantees. Insiders say it wasn't just about money. It was about respect. Jackson had become the glue of the MCU, and yet his early contracts didn't reflect his value. He managed to fix that in time, but his earlier losses serve as a cautionary tale for even A-listers. Unless the contract is airtight and the accounting transparent, even superheroes can be shortchanged. Dan O'Bannon. Dan O'Bannon wrote Alien, one of the most influential sci-fi horror films ever made. But after it exploded into a global franchise, he found himself fighting just to be remembered, let alone paid. O'Bannon sold the script to 20th Century Fox for a modest fee and was promised back-end royalties. But as the franchise expanded, those royalties dried up. Despite multiple sequels and merchandise revenue in the hundreds of millions, O'Bannon claimed he was cut out of profits due to legal technicalities and deliberate obfuscation. He spoke out before his death in 2009, expressing bitterness that the studio had stolen the creature from him. He wasn't referring to the monster itself, but to the ownership, the credit, and the rewards that followed. The mind behind one of cinema's most terrifying creations was devoured not by a xenomorph, but by contracts and corporations. O'Bannon's story serves as a haunting final note in this saga, a reminder that behind every blockbuster lies a paper trail of broken promises and dreams denied. Hollywood may sell dreams, but when it comes to money, it often delivers nightmares. These 25 stars remind us that even the biggest names can be outwitted by the smallest fine print. Want more untold stories from the golden screen? Subscribe and stay tuned for the truths Hollywood doesn't want you to know.